The little boy met an old man who had never seen such a magical trick before. The flute began to hang in the air, and the old man disappeared out of thin air. The tree next to him also suddenly disappeared. From then on, the boy continued to study magic and practiced it wherever he went. This attracted the attention of a rich girl. Sophie couldn't help but follow him. Edward asked her to choose a card, write down the suit, and put it in the deck. Miraculously, she not only found the card, but also floated in the air. Sophie was full of admiration, but because of Edward's humble status, Sophie's family would not allow them to be together. But in the next few years, the two would always come to their secret base. Sophie dreamed that one day, Edward would use magic to take her away. She designed a pendant because the prince wanted to come to watch the performance. An inspector was curious about Edward's magic and came backstage to know the principal. But the magician's props were his rice bowl. In the second performance, Edward prepared a large mirror and required audience interaction. The prince stood up and introduced his girlfriend. When Edward saw her for the first time, he recognized her as Sophie. Although he had mixed feelings, the performance had to continue. He put on a red cloak for Sophie, asked her to turn around and come to the mirror, and then put a hat on her. But when he bowed, the person in the mirror did not follow him. Suddenly, another person appeared in the mirror, but there was nothing behind Sophie. The man raised his knife, and the audience became nervous. Edward stretched out his arm, and the soul of the man in the mirror followed the guidance and came out. Edward stepped forward to catch him, took off his cloak for him, and ended this wonderful performance. This encounter was a huge psychological shock to him. The prince waited in the reception room for a long time, firstly to verify his guess about. In the evening, Edward received a letter from Sophie, and early the next morning, their carriages stopped together, and Sophie got on Edward's carriage. Sophie recognized Edward. She had dreamed of seeing him again for so many years, but Edward tried his best to control his emotions and got off the carriage. Sophie kept the token of their love on her chest and was responsible for monitoring. Sophie's detective received the news that she had met Edward. This was a well-planned magic trick, and the prince in the audience was convinced that he would crack it. Edward made an image appear on the white paper through the air, and it was the prince's father. The prince stood up to check the portrait, and there were no traces of strokes on the painting, indicating that he was pre-coated with chemical dyes and would only appear after being sprayed with special chemicals. As he said that, he began to check Edward's sleeves, but unfortunately, he did not find anything. Edward sarcastically asked the butler to turn on the lights so that the prince could see more clearly, but the prince sent someone to remove the shelf to make things difficult for him and asked Edward to show everyone a trick without props. He asked the prince for his sword and used it to introduce the story of the sword and the stone. Many great warriors had tried to pull it out, but none of them succeeded. Only one man pulled it out of the stone without any effort. It is not the man whose regime, and Sophie would become a pawn in his plan. Edward asked him to leave here and run away with him, but Sophie knew that once they did so, the two families would chase them to the ends of the earth. This scene seemed to have returned to that night, 15 years ago. Edward's performance poster was destroyed, and they were ordered to leave the theater. He took out all his savings, but he didn't notice that someone was following him to meet with Sophie to plan something. And all of this was seen by the inspector's men. The inspector followed Edward and happened to hear all the plans. He informed the prince of this matter in a vague way. At night, Sophie found the prince and wanted to cancel the engagement. She was unwilling to be a pawn in the prince's plan. The prince slapped Sophie hard and scolded her for her behavior with Edward, but for his own plan, he still asked Sophie, and it seemed that she was seriously injured. The guards at the door also saw this scene. Edward was still waiting at the door for Sophie to come over. The next day, the handsome white horse strolled on the street and finally returned to the door. The housekeeper found blood on the horse's back, and everyone began a carpet search. Finally, with the help of the police dog, they found Sophie by the river. Edward rushed to Sophie without hesitation, but she was already dead. After the doctor's examination, Sophie died of excessive blood loss. There was a wound on her neck left by a sharp knife. The doctor even found a ruby in Sophie's underwear. Edward knew that it must have been done by the prince. The inspector, who was in cahoots with the prince, certainly did not want to accept this statement. The inspector seemed to see a glowing object in the haystack of the prince's stable, but when he looked closely, there was nothing. In the end, he could only find a scapegoat at random, and the matter ended there. Edward bought a theatre and prepared to start performing again. The inspector knew that Edward would not give up, so he had been watching secretly. The show Edward performed was no longer magic, but spiritualism. He wanted to overthrow the prince. This was a magic that broke human cognition. Edward stretched out his hand to the props on the side, and a heat wave rose up. The audience's attention was on the rising smoke. As the smoke continued to gather, a soul appeared in front of him. "How have you come to be here tonight? Are you alive? What can you tell us about the other side?" The spirit is overwhelmed by the questions the audience asks him, and Edward makes him disappear. After the show, a crowd of people blocked the back door, hoping to see their deceased loved ones again. With the reappearance of the dead, a new sense of republicanism is quietly emerging. The prince orders the inspector to find Edward's flaws and then jail him for fraud. They set up a projector, but the effect is real and hard to describe. In order to prove his psychic ability, Edward even lets the child pass through the crowd, which makes the inspector even more confused, so he simply takes Edward back to the police station. First the orange tree, now this. They asked him how he did it. Edward kept silent, and the window was crowded with Edward's supporters. The inspector threatened him that this was a fraud, and the more the audience made a commotion, the heavier his crime would be. Edward suddenly stood up and went to the balcony to explain to everyone that what they saw were all illusions, a magician's performance. In this way, he got rid of the charge of fraud, and the inspector had no reason to imprison him. The prince was furious and informed the inspector that he couldn't do even the smallest thing well, so he went out himself and disguised himself as an ordinary person to sneak into the theatre. But this time, Edward summoned Sophie, and when Sophie was not the real murderer, everyone couldn't help but think of the prince because he had killed a woman before. Edward's purpose was to confuse the inspector. The inspector found Edward and used both soft and hard tactics, hoping that he would cherish his life. He admired Edward very much, but if he insisted on doing this, the inspector would be powerless. The next night, he summoned all the people and said that if Edward did anything out of line, he would take action. But he still summoned Sophie. The audience began to ask him who the murderer was, but he said that his necklace was missing. The scene began to be chaotic, and the inspector had to go on stage to announce his arrest. Looking at the disappearing Inspector Sophie, he felt bad. He stepped forward to take Edward away, but his hand was empty. Edward stood up and walked to the front of the stage, and his body began to evaporate. The inspector came to Edward's forest villa, but found a design drawing on the table. He suddenly remembered the light he found in the stable last time. In the middle of the night, he went to the stable to confirm his idea. Sure enough, he found the necklace in the haystack, and next to it was an emerald, which was exactly what he had seen that day. He asked the butler to bring the prince's accessories, and the emerald was exactly what the sword was missing, and next to it was the ruby that the doctor had found. The inspector wrote a letter of complaint overnight and entrusted someone to send it to the king, saying that the prince was planning to rebel, and the sword was sent to the police headquarters. He stayed to confront the prince. The prince said that you were deceived by Inspector Down was promoted as he wished. He savored his excellent case handling ability and then put it in his pocket. He was walking leisurely on the road when a little boy stopped him and handed him a document containing the magic trick of the orange tree. He touched his pocket and found that the pendant had been taken away by the boy, and Edward was not far away. When he chased to the train station, the train had already started. When he stopped chasing, he instantly understood what happened. Sophie had drugged the prince. Edward forged evidence of the prince's crime and used potion to fake his own death. Edward's perfect plan, and at his own stupidity and ignorance. The film ends here. So what is this film about? In fact, he's wearing the cloak of love and using a seemingly suspenseful way to push the plot forward. However, many people may have guessed halfway through that this is a plan born for love. But the director uses this mentality to make his mistake love for our ancestors and miss its true meaning, which is illusion. He is telling us that what we see is not necessarily true. In the movie, the inspector sees and cares most about politics and the people. Those who create illusions always get away with it. Edward used magic to tell the inspector that what you see is not necessarily the truth. As for the prince killing people, that is just a legend. What started as domestic violence was gradually spread to people is murder. But he only touched Sophie once, from beginning to end. Everything he did was to protect the goal he wanted to achieve. The real villains are Edward and Sophie, and for more such amazing movie explanations and in-depth analyses, don't forget to subscribe to the Flix Clarity YouTube channel. We bring you the finest breakdowns of your favorite films, uncover hidden meanings, and explore the deeper layers of storytelling. Your support keeps us motivated to deliver even more engaging content. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join our growing community of movie enthusiasts. We hope you enjoyed the video, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more cinematic insights.